Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't. But having said that, actually, the weather will become very windy, but most of the strong winds, incidentally, will be down over Spain and across into...
This is Anglia Television. Now the news at 10.
Are dead in southern England's worst night since the war. The ferries beached, the trains are stopped, the roads are blocked. How the insurance people say they'll deal with claims. In the Gulf, another tanker's hit. America blames Iran. And they've got Jessica down the well, and she's all right. Good evening. The Queen and Mrs. Thatcher have both sent messages of sympathy tonight after southern England's most violent storm for 300 years. The Queen, who's at the Commonwealth meeting in Canada, says she's greatly distressed by the death and destruction. Gales of more than 100 miles an hour killed at least 13 people, injured hundreds more, and wrecked thousands of homes in the south and the east. The Home Secretary, Mr. Hurd, called it the worst night of disaster since the end of the war. Coast Guard say officially it was a hurricane. 7 people died under fallen trees, 3 died under collapsed buildings, power lines were cut, a third of the country was without electricity. London was blacked out for the first time since the Blitz. Trains in the south and east were stopped. In the city, share dealings were stopped and the foreign exchanges closed. Only a handful of London's high street banks opened.
The Meteorological Office is holding a full investigation to find out why weathermen failed to predict the storms. They, like the rest of the country, were taken completely by surprise. What they did know was that a deep depression surrounded by spinning winds had formed in the Bay of Biscay. They said it wouldn't get past the Channel, but the gales hit northwest Brittany around 11 o'clock last night and arrived at Dorset and Hampshire around midnight. By 3 in the morning, the storms were in London and the southeast. By 6, the gales were heading for the Midlands, and around 8 this morning, they'd left Humberside for the North Sea and Norway.
At one stage last night, Hampshire police said every major road in the county was closed. One man died when a tree hit his car. Others simply didn't see the obstacles in time. No one was hurt in this incident, one of dozens of minor crashes all over the south. But 2 firemen died and 4 were injured when a tree crashed onto their fire engine. They had been racing to one of thousands of emergency calls. At Barton-on-Sea in Dorset, a family narrowly escaped injury when the side of their flat collapsed. And in nearby Highcliffe, 90 pensioners had to be evacuated when their roof was ripped clean away. Inside, their rooms had been left wide open to the elements. One relative had rushed to comfort her elderly mother. Others told of their terror last night.
I heard a crack and a bang and something fell on my bed. Yes. And I got right under the bedclothes and right down and covered myself well over. And then somebody called out to us, "Are you all right?" And I said, "Yes, we're under the bedclothes." And we could hear the man in the next flat calling, "Help, help."
At sea, the wind and heavy swell had swept away most of Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight. Its theatre and rows of amusement arcades were all lost. And on the Hampshire coast, a cargo ship was driven onto the sand where she stuck fast. The crew could only wait patiently for the next high tide to try and refloat her. Other smaller vessels weren't so lucky. All along the coast, small boats had been torn from their moorings and dumped unceremoniously onto the beach. Of the south coast towns, Brighton was perhaps hardest hit. In the city centre, trees were uprooted, and one of the stone minarets on Brighton's Royal Pavilion crashed through the roof onto a £90,000 carpet below. It could delay present restoration work by a year. Almost as expensive was the damage to light aircraft. Many had spent the night upside down, turned over like toys by the wind. Some gusts near Southampton were measured at 108 miles per hour, enough to flatten acres of woodland and bring down power cables all over the south. Some towns will be without electricity for a second night tonight, and the electricity board say it could be 3 days before some outlying areas get power back. And with the wind had come torrential rain. From the air, the extent of last night's flooding became apparent. Tonight, calm weather has returned to the south, but the clearing up has only just begun. James Mates, News at 10, on the south coast.
The 100-mile-an-hour wind swept along the Kent coast, leaving a trail of devastation. 2 British crewmen died when a 1,500-ton Cypriot bulk carrier sank outside Dover Harbour. 4 others were rescued. A Sea-Link cross-channel ferry ran aground at Folkestone. There were no passengers on board. Firemen helped the crew to safety. At a big hotel in Hastings, a massive chimney stack collapsed, ripped a 20-foot hole in the roof and crashed through 3 floors. One guest hung onto a door handle and was rescued as he hung in mid-air. An elderly couple plunged 2 floors down. The man died. His wife miraculously escaped, protected by a mattress.
We heard the voice of a lady in there, and I got her out about an hour later. But there was still, her husband was missing, and he was found 7 o'clock this morning.
A 55-year-old woman died as she slept when a 20-foot tree smashed through her roof. A caravan site near Folkestone was wrecked. 20 families lost their homes. An old church collapsed, its spire ripped from the foundations. Few people escaped the effects of the storm. Damage to houses is being estimated in millions. Thousands of acres of land are underwater, and tonight Kent police warned there are more floods on the way. Phil Roman, News at 10 in the southeast.
In East Anglia, gusts coming off the North Sea at up to 90 miles an hour left a trail of destruction in their wake. In Harwich, the prison ship Earl William, with its 40 Tamil refugees on board, was holed just above the waterline and broke free of its moorings. Hours later, it was grounded and re-anchored safely. Off the Wash, oil rig workers had to be airlifted to safety when a support vessel drifted dangerously close, threatening to ram the rig. Many ships were grounded in the Thames estuary. Damage is estimated at hundreds of thousands of pounds. Others seeking a safe harbour were escorted through dangerous waters. Coast Guards received calls from more than 300 people who'd lost their boats during the height of the storm. The Force 11 gale brought down power cables right across East Anglia. 20,000 people were without electricity. Many could be cut off for some time to come. Lorries were picked up and simply cast aside as the winds blew across the bleakness of the fens. Incredibly, few serious injuries were reported. The villages were particularly badly hit. Cars were crushed as trees as tall as 50 feet were ripped out by their roots. Farmers joined council workmen and emergency services in their bid to reopen more than 100 blocked routes. But as dusk fell tonight in the city of Norwich, people made their way home in little more than a gentle breeze. There was little evidence of the hazards of the past 18 hours. Judy Laybourne, News at 10, East Anglia.
Londoners woke up to find the capital virtually paralysed. Millions had no electricity, no telephone lines and no way of getting to work. In some cases, the 94-mile-an-hour gales wreaked such havoc, people had to abandon their homes. A tower block was evacuated because officials feared serious structural damage. Falling masonry was a hazard everywhere. A tramp was killed when a wall fell on him, and this man was badly burned when he lit a candle near a camping gas stove.
I was trying to put the container onto the gas stove, and it wouldn't go on. It was near the candle, and suddenly all the gas whooshed out and it ignited with the candle.
The gales simply ripped these garages apart. Roofs and walls were scattered over a wide area. Residents had to dig their cars out of the rubble, only to join the traffic jams picking their way through the debris. Suburban rail commuters attempting to get into town found all the trains cancelled on British Rail's Network South East. And people trying to get out of London on the intercity service got no further than the mainline stations. There were plenty of hopeful passengers queuing up for information, but no trains at the platforms to take them anywhere. London Bridge, normally chock-a-block in the rush hour, was virtually deserted as the city gents stayed at home. The big institutions were at a standstill. Power failures hit the computers and the stock exchange closed down for the day. So was any trading done.
Very pale shadow of the normal level of trade.
Can you remember anything like this before?
Never, no. Not even Christmas Eve or the big freeze up last year, no, it's exceptional.
The few money men who did make it into work found themselves at a loose end as the city ground to a halt. John Draper, News at 10, Central London.
There's not been a storm like this in the South Coast counties for as long as anyone can remember. certainly the scale of the devastation hasn't been experienced since the Second World War. Houses and blocks of flats had their roofs torn away. People were rescued by firemen from buildings in danger of collapse. 2 firemen were killed answering an emergency call in Dorset when a tree fell on their cab. 2 Sussex policemen were lucky to escape when their patrol car was hit by a falling tree. This pile of flotsam is all that's left of the famous Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight. It had withstood channel storms for nearly a century, but last night gave up the struggle. It's the end of the pier. The owners say it wasn't insured and nobody could possibly afford to replace it. All along the south coast, there's been wholesale damage to yachts and boatyards.
The hurricane-force winds which lashed the capital in the early hours of the morning were the worst ever recorded, up to 107 miles an hour. The West End took a battering. Some department stores had their shop fronts blown out. By dawn, the winds had died down, but the damage remained. Many roads were blocked by fallen trees. Commuters were advised to stay at home. Those who didn't had to find their own way around or through obstacles. The London Fire Brigade was inundated with a record number of emergency calls. In North London, firemen rescued a woman after a chimney collapsed. She fell through every floor of the 3-storey house, but wasn't seriously hurt. Large areas of London and the southeast had power cuts. Overhead, electricity lines were blown down, forcing generating stations to be switched out of the national grid to prevent an overload. The power failures and the fact that so few city workers made it to work meant that there were almost no deals struck on either the stock exchange or the money markets. Most dealers took the opportunity to go for an early and a long lunch. Down in the Thames estuary, a crane was blown onto its side at the port of Sheerness. Troops were called in to help clear up at a devastated caravan site on the south coast. A sealing ferry was blown aground near Folkestone. All 20 members of the crew are safe. There were no passengers on board. And further along the south coast, a graphic example of the power of the storm. A Sussex woodland, flattened by the wind.
At the Suffolk port of Felixstowe, the tanker the Silver Falcon was torn from its berth in a force 11 gale, swept out into the harbour after first smashing into a jetty. The docks were evacuated in case of an explosion. Eventually a tug was able to tow the tanker into Ipswich. At Harwich, the Home Office detention ship, the ferry Earl William, was also out of control in the Stour estuary. Tamil refugees on board had a frightening time as the ship temporarily ran aground before finding a firm anchorage. At Jaywick, 100 caravans were wrecked. Campers were evacuated to a nearby school, damage put at more than £250,000. The camp's amusement arcade reduced to a pile of rubble. On the main roads this morning, drivers weaved their way around four...
Earlier on today, apparently, a woman rang the BBC and said she heard that there was a hurricane on the way. Well, if you're watching, don't worry, there isn't.
Within hours of that reassuring forecast, the worst storm in 300 years ripped through our region. 18 people died, including 2 firefighters in Dorset answering a 999 call. Damage was put at £1 billion. Shanklin Pier on the Isle of Wight, one of the first landmarks to be destroyed. 15 million trees were scattered like matchsticks as winds of up to 120 miles per hour cut a swathe through the countryside.
I've never seen anything like it before, and I hope I'll never see anything like it again.
It's a night David Marchant remembers vividly. He works at Wakehurst Place near Ardingly in Sussex. He woke to find the country estate almost unrecognisable.
It was complete devastation. Glass was coming out of the big glass houses and flying across the yard like sheets of A4 paper, just fluttering in the breeze. And the girl from the nursery wanted to go and work in the glass houses, and she was oblivious to this because her car had just been crushed by a massive great pine tree.
Along the south coast, exposed buildings bore the brunt of the storm. In Hastings, a hotel guest was killed when a chimney stack collapsed. At Highcliffe in Dorset, a block of flats was opened up to the elements. Elderly residents left shell-shocked.
We got them all out, all dressed, all with the pension books at the other, except for one lady, which was our next-door neighbour. And the harder I banged on the door, the more she told me to shut up and stop that silly noise, and she never did get up, actually.
Millions of homes were left without power and thousands of roads blocked by fallen trees. 25 years after the Great Storm, Rushy Hill caravan site in Peacehaven is a picture of tranquility. But this was the scene which confronted Rona Neal as she came back to her mobile home.
You can't imagine what it was like. When I walked down the road, I was disorientated where the actual road was because of all the debris, and you really had to thought, where am I going, you know? It was horrible. The next day there were people up here actually looting.
At sea, another drama was playing out. The cross-channel ferry, the Hengist, had lost power and was drifting helplessly in the darkness.
Everyone was extremely concerned for each other's safety. Yeah. I mean, the black lights came on. Basically, we had nothing at all. The captain did say, "I think we should say a prayer now," and I certainly prayed. Yeah, I didn't think we were going to get off at one stage. I thought that was it.
Eventually, the ship ran aground near Folkestone. It turned out to be a blessing in disguise.
It's where we landed. If we'd have gone a bit further along, we would have finished up on rocks, and it would have foundered then. Yeah.
Toys Hill, the highest point in Kent, found itself in the eye of the storm, losing 98% of its canopy. The National Trust tried clearing and replanting, but let some areas regenerate naturally. Today, fallen trees like this beech are still growing.
You've got mosses and lichens and fungi on the dead wood, all that dead wood habitat for the invertebrates. And so we got quite a good mixed habitat just by leaving it alone and letting it come back, and that's really what nature does.
Nature was quick to take advantage. Wild boar escaped through broken farm fences and have never looked back. Rare birds like woodlarks and nightjars moved into new clearings, and even woodland began to recover.
So this is one of the first trees really that we planted after the storm, a year or so afterwards, and it's grown this size within the 25 years, which is quite an astonishing rate of growth, really.
Ultimately, the storm of 1987 didn't just show how destructive nature can be, it also revealed its extraordinary powers of regeneration. Malcolm Shaw in Ardingly for Meridian Tonight.
Well, that night, yes. I mean, I was living just up the road there in Frobisher Way, and I was awoken by the noise of the tile coming down the roof. So obviously, like you would be, I was very curious as to what was happening. I could hear it was a very windy night. But what I experienced that night was something that I've never experienced quite before, and that was I was in the midst of a hurricane. That night I didn't realise it was a hurricane. All I see was dustbins flying down the road, fence panels, sheets of glass smashing everywhere, and roof tiles coming off of all the roofs. So it was quite a daunting experience. Very, very windy, very, very noisy. And in a strange sort of way, quite exciting, really. Well, everywhere, all down this road there was trees scattered everywhere across the road. And as small as what these trees are, they're normally quite a strong tree, but they were just actually torn from the ground like toys. It was quite incredible, actually. All the way down Marley Way, there was trees all toppled over everywhere, and all across here, there was brush everywhere. It was quite children playing in the streets. It was like a forest in the street. The initial idea was to capture it because my children were small at the time, and I just wanted to capture it as a piece of their lives. But now when I look back at it now, it's just incredible just to watch this and just to go back and sort of revisit those moments. And when you look at the videos now, look at the video footage, you can see the size of some of those trees that actually come down that night, and you can appreciate really how lucky we was really in some respects that it was only mainly property damage and there wasn't more injuries than what there were.